Vice-Chancellor. Good evening. Good evening. Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Research and Innovation, and members of the Executive Management, deans, heads of departments, directors, family and friends of Professor Kevin Lobb, his wife Adele, daughters Jessica and Claire, colleagues and students. Good evening and welcome to this special Vice-Chancellor's Distinguished Senior Teaching Award lecture. The Vice-Chancellor's Distinguished Senior Teaching Award is an award that is normally made annually to an individual with more than 10 years experience teaching at this university, who has demonstrated that his or her teaching is truly exceptional. In 2020 and 2021, the COVID-19 pandemic challenged and changed many spheres of academic life, particularly teaching and learning. In recognition of this, a special award was introduced to acknowledge academics who, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, responded by creating and designing innovative online or remote teaching courses, which successfully catered for the needs of their students. The 2021 Special Distinguished Senior Teaching Award was presented to Associate Professor Kevin Lobb of the Department of Chemistry in the Faculty of Science at the April graduation ceremony. As a Rhodes University alumnus, Professor Lobb taught at high school level for 4 years before returning to Rhodes University to complete his honors and PhD in chemistry. While studying for his PhD, he worked as a temporary lecturer in the chemistry department. In 2006, he was employed as a nuclear magnetic resonance specialist here at Rhodes University, a position which also had a teaching component. He set up and presently maintains his department's computer cluster. Soon after getting the role of the nuclear magnetic specialist, he was offered a position as a lecturer in the chemistry department, a position in which he has thrived. He rose to associate professor in physical organic chemistry in 2019 and is a National Foundation NRF C3 rated researcher. His research and teaching focus on computational chemistry and molecular modeling, and his involvement with the Rhodes University bioinformatics program has led to a strong chemoinformatics component to his research. Professor Lobb has been involved for many years with the ESCOM Expo at regional level, serving on the regional committee and acting as a regional convener for the past 9 years. He has been one of the judges at the International Science Fair 4 times, and has acted as a convener of judges for the chemistry, biochemistry category 3 times over the last 3 years. In 2021, he completed his postgraduate diploma in higher education, PGD, in higher education through Rhodes University. Professor Lobb teaches at all levels, from first-year classes totaling 460 students to teaching some master's coursework in bioinformatics. His current teaching involves 6 undergraduate and 3 postgraduate courses, and he supervises 7 postgraduate students. During his time at Rhodes University, he has supervised 39 postgraduate students, could be more. It was these treasured students he had at the front of his mind when during the COVID-19 pandemic, lecturers were forced to adapt their ways of teaching. Professor Lobb created teaching strategies that assisted students during remote and online teaching and continue to be useful today when COVID-19 lockdown restrictions have been repealed and in-person instruction commenced. Professor Lobb's dedication and selflessness did not go unnoticed by his students, several of whom saw him fit to be honored with this special distinguished teaching award. As ever, it is best to turn to the students' words to highlight the impact Professor Lobb has had on their learning experience. One student attested to Professor Lobb's online teaching methodology in this way. I quote, "He made YouTube videos and recordings for us. He went an extra mile to actually teach his course and not just read over his slides. He explained the work in detail and was patient with us. His emails were open 24/7, and he was quick to respond," close quote. Another student had this to say, I quote, "Professor Lobb was always there for us when we needed him. He was very understanding about the problems students faced from the transition of face-to-face learning to online learning. And he made sure he was available to help whenever his hand was needed," close quote. Today, we acknowledge someone who has served Rhodes University with dedication and distinction for nearly 20 years, someone whose contribution has gone a long way in making this university lead the way in creating flexible and collaborative learning methods that are relevant and meaningful. I hope we will all find inspiration in his shared journey tonight. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor and privilege to invite Professor Kevin Lobb to present his special distinguished senior teaching award lecture titled Software-Based Chemistry and its Ideal Placement in Remote and Post-COVID-19 Learning. Over to you, Prof.
Before I start my lecture, there are three very particular thank yous that I need to say. The first is thank you to our VC, Prof. Mathazela, for this award, and it really means a huge amount to me. The second thank you is to Prof. Monopula Apasela. Thank you very much for the kind words, both here and at the graduation. And my final thank you is to the team, to Prof. Martin Hill and team who went through all the resources that I passed on to them and went through, and the feedback that came from him and his team. So really a big thank you. There are many more thank yous that I have to go through, but I will get to those later. These are really important to state at this point. Okay, so if I can just share the screen, and if I can get this going. Okay. There we go. Okay, so my talk is on software-based chemistry and its ideal placement in remote post-COVID learning. Please, there are a series of anecdotes that I'm going to run through, and some of them are not going to be perfectly connected with each other, but I hope that at the end you will see the full story of what I want to say. So just as a preface, in my department, we have got a strong tradition of both research and teaching. And I'm really proud to be associated with colleagues who have excelled both in the research field and in the teaching field. But I really want to highlight the tradition in my department. So I'm going to take you back to the chemistry department and give you a little bit of history in our department. There is, of course, the Distinguished Teaching Award has been around for a long time. And one of the earliest recipients is here today is Professor Perry Kay in the department. And also in our department, soon after that, we had another awardee was Professor Mike Davies Coleman. And more recently, also in the lecture theatre now, Mrs. Joyce Suri also received this award. And I'm honored now to be at this point receiving. But I know, I have seen my colleagues teaching. I know I'm surrounded by excellent teachers. And I'm trying to find my colleagues in the audience because I know that their faces are going to be here. I just don't know in what order. And at present, I don't know the dates. We'll look back and see this. Okay, so that brings us to chapter 1. I don't know if you read a lot of novels, but when you come to chapter 1 in a novel, chapter 1 is the chapter where the author immerses you in their world so they can start the story. So this is my chapter 1, and I want to immerse you in my world, or perhaps not quite in my world, maybe simply in my office. So if you see my office there, I've got a bottle of 2-propanol, and there's a very good reason I have it in my office. I use it for cleaning ink because we use ink quite a lot in teaching. And you can see that when I mix it with the ink, it's starting to smudge, it's starting to dissolve. And I'm a chemist, and I like to explain its properties. And the way I explain its properties is I look very closely at the 2-propanol. I zoom in. I zoom as close as I can into until I can see the molecules. And there are many molecules there, so it's difficult to see what's going on. So you have to separate out one to see the single molecule of 2-propanol. Now, 2-propanol is interesting because it has an oxygen atom, which is normally in chemistry in the molecule represented in red, and there are carbon atoms represented in dark gray, and there are hydrogen atoms floating around as well. There are other ways to represent this molecule, and you might see the molecule represented in one of these 2 ways, and they're all talking about the 2-propanol molecule. However, I like another representation of the molecule, and that is called the Smiles representation. The Smiles representation is really, really fantastic because you can see in the 2-propanol, you've got an oxygen that's connected to another carbon and another carbon. You've got a chain, an oxygen connected to carbon, another carbon. But on the side, in brackets, is the 3rd carbon that is there. Now, the Smiles representation encompasses everything about the molecule. Everything is contained in that. And interestingly, we can use computers to simply take the string and calculate the properties of 2-propanol. However, what I did in my office, we need to go back. What I did in my office was I mixed 2-propanol with ink. So I need to rewind a bit, and I need to look at that mixture of 2-propanol and ink, because what I'm seeing happening with the ink is not a property of 2-propanol itself. It's a property of the interaction. So I need to look at the 2-propanol, maybe hide it to see if I can see parts of ink. That's resin that's often in permanent markers. We need to hide that too. And we can get down to maybe the dye that's in ink. What we're seeing in my office is an interaction between the 2-propanol and the dye in the ink. So this here is a molecule of a dye in the ink. And of course, we've got different ways of representing that molecule as well. There are different ways we can do. We can even have a name that's there. But my representation that I like the most, again, is the Smiles representation. Because the Smiles representation has every single atom in it. If I asked you how many carbon atoms were in it, you would be able to go through and you'd be able to count them and you would know exactly how many there are. And computers can do that extremely, extremely fast. And so if I were to give this string to a computer, the computer would highlight some of the properties of that pigment blue 60 that is in ink. Okay, so let me take a step back. And I've got a colleague here who tells us, who's got a very nice way of describing chemistry. Chemists work in 3 domains. My colleague Joyce Suri always tells me that chemists work in 3 domains. They work in the macroscopic, they work in the microscopic, and they work in the symbolic domains. And I really love that description of chemistry because I'm a computational chemist and we use computers quite a lot. What can we use computers for? Well, if you've got a microscopic representation, a molecule on the computer can instantly tell you what the symbolic representation is. You can ask, well, what's the smiles? The computer will do that instantly. You can provide a smile string to a computer. You can enter it in. If you've got the right software, that computer can, with a little bit of effort, convert the smiles back to its 3D representation. But that is not the power of computers when it comes to chemistry. That's not the power. The power is even more than that, because computers can calculate what the macroscopic properties are of the compounds based on the microscopic. The computers can also calculate the properties of molecules based on that smile string. That is incredibly powerful for us. So the question I've got now is, what kinds of properties can be calculated? So on the one side, if you've got the symbolic, what you're looking at is chemical information. If you look at chemical information and you have these strings, you can calculate many, many things. I've spoken to you that we can calculate the number of carbon atoms. That we can do perhaps by looking at it, but computers can do it very fast. They can calculate from that string the molecular formula, the molecular mass. They can calculate directly from the smile string some properties that tell us how these molecules interact with people, with living systems. These are very powerful properties that can be calculated in this way. However, if you convert to the microscopic system, what can be calculated? Well, if you've got the microscopic system, you can calculate things like the normal modes of vibration, how a molecule vibrates. You can calculate how electrons move in molecules. These are how electrons move in molecules. And then once you know how electrons move in molecules, you start to know how molecules interact with light. But my favorite thing my favorite simulation, or what I like to look at, is you can calculate how molecules interact with other molecules. So for example, in simulation, you can calculate how the ink in the dye interacts with the propanol in my office. Okay. How important are these calculations? Well, I do a lot of computational chemistry, and I'm very closely associated with Ruby. In my own small research group, some of whom are here, our allocation this year is 3 million CPU hours at the CHPC. Now, this is a talk about teaching. I want to just give you an idea of the challenges of teaching. Because if I had a look at the computers that I've got available for teaching, it would take those teaching computers 40 years to do that amount of calculation that I've got available to me. So even before COVID hit, we had a problem. The problem was, how could we sustainably teach computational chemistry here at Rhodes? Okay. Right, and now we're on to chapter 2. I don't know if you've ever had to deal with a specialized textbook, because if you have a specialized textbook on a topic, chapter 1 is always the mathematical background. The real topic of a textbook starts in chapter 2. So let us start and have a look at chapter 2. And chapter 2 really is about the challenges during lockdown. A really critical challenge we had is, how could we provide access to computational chemistry during lockdown? And my strategy was as follows. in Struben building, we've got a stack of computers that are all devoted to performing calculations of molecules. My strategy was to isolate one of those computers and to separate it from the rest and to make that particular computer dedicated to teaching computational chemistry and aspects of it. A big thank you goes to David Seaborger and the IT division for doing this, because he was able to do this remotely, to separate it out remotely. And once he had separated it out remotely, I'm not going to go into details of the services that were installed on it, save to say that the web interface that students see to it, I tried to make that web interface as simple as possible. This is the interface. You can see through a web browser, you can get to that particular server, and there's a lot of power behind that server to do calculations. You'll notice that there are two buttons on this, because there are two aspects that I wanted the students to be able to access remotely. One is I wanted them to be able to access calculations in the microscopic domain. And secondly, I wanted them to be able to access calculations in the symbolic domain. Okay, and I'll just show you maybe what students might see through both of these interfaces. On the one side, on the left-hand side for the microscopic is WebMo Pro. WebMo is really, really powerful. It's a tool. And what you can do as a student or as a user, you can come to the system and with a few clicks of the mouse button, you can construct a molecule. One thing that drew me to WebMo is not everyone would have had access to computers. And so WebMo has got a cell phone. It's got a cell phone application that can also connect to the server. So you can draw the same molecules either on the browser or on a cell phone. But that visualization is really powerful. But add to that power the possibility that WebMo can pass on information to more powerful programs. So if a student wants to calculate the properties of a molecule, they simply need to draw it and ask for a calculation to be done. And WebMo will handle sending that information to the same software we use in research. The calculation will be done and the results come back. They are collated then by WebMo. So let me show you exactly what comes back for students. So here is a result of a calculation where you can see the partial charges on a particular molecule. What parts are negatively charged? What parts are positively charged? The information that comes back, for instance, on a cell phone, you can start to see where electrons place themselves in molecules. Us as chemists would term these orbitals and their energies associated with it. And more interestingly, I love to twist molecules. If you twist a molecule, you can start to see how the energy goes up. And if you twist it further, it relaxes. And you can see the profile as it goes through. Okay. This has been a powerful resource that I've been using even post-COVID. It doesn't matter where you are. If you're in the department with a student, you can connect by a web interface to these tools. If you're at home, you can carry on doing your work on the system. But as a teacher, I've found it really, really amazing, because if I go into a lecture, if I need to show the students something, I can simply access the resource myself and do the calculation right there with them. Okay, so this is really great. But on the other hand, I just need to say thank you to the WebMo team, because they gave me access to their servers. They gave me sub-administrator access. I was able to add my students onto their servers while I was setting our one up. And so we were able to do work even before I fully had the system set up. Okay. On the other hand, also on the server, I've got available to the students Jupyter Hub, which gives students access to the Jupyter Notebook. And this is really great in terms of chemical information. So you can see over there, you can see at the top, you can see a smile string, and this is a string of carbons joined together. You run that line, you press run in the notebook, and almost immediately you see a chemical representation of that molecule. You can make changes to the SMILE strings and see how those change. But even in the notebook, if you're not happy with that representation of molecules, in the Jupyter notebook, you can also create a microscopic version of your molecule in which you can rotate it right there in the notebook. Okay, all this is done through a powerful API called RDKit. And RDKit brings a lot of chemistry to life within this notebook. Okay. So what kind of work can we do with chemical information using Jupyter notebooks? Well, for our senior undergraduates, one problem that I've presented to them relates to a very large molecule that's over. If you have a look at this molecule is so large that I won't even attempt to draw the atoms. Rather, I'm going to follow biologists' principle of drawing ribbons to show where the atoms are. It's an incredibly large molecule of protein. And its job, it is part of machinery of the COVID-19 life cycle. What I've done in this picture here is I've drawn the surface of the molecule. And notice that if you look carefully, attached to the surface is another molecule, a much smaller one. This molecule is binding very tightly to the surface of that COVID-19 main protease. And what it does is it really is a spanner in the works. It disrupts the whole life cycle of COVID-19. So the question is, what can I do with my undergrads? How can I introduce them to chemical information using this, what we have in front of us? Well, this molecule that disrupts the COVID-19 life cycle is quite interesting because I need to create a problem for the students to solve. And the problem comes from a paper which has an absolutely wonderful title. And the title of the paper is Quantifying the Chemical Beauty of Drugs. What this paper presents is presents a metric, and this metric is called Quantitative Estimation of Drug Likeness. Now, this is a very strange metric because it pulls together many other metrics. What it tries to do is it tries to say, you've got a molecule and it can interact many different ways with humans. It might be toxic, it might be easily absorbed. What this does is it tries to take all that complexity of how a molecule interacts with a human, and it tries to reduce it to a single number. Now, you might say that reducing that complexity is bad. We need to know we need to know the complexity of how molecules interact with people. But what if you're trying to deal with chemical information? What if you've got 1 billion compounds that you're trying to search through? Then you need something simple that will then filter out what we don't need and what we do need. And so I introduced them to this QED metric. And what's nice is that in the Jupyter notebook, it's very easy to calculate this metric for this molecule that disrupts COVID. And the metric you find after you calculate is 0.74, which estimation of drug likeness is 74%. So it's not great. You've got a molecule that interacts, that disrupts the COVID-19 life cycle, but it's not so great when you interact with humans. So how do we sort this out? And so what we do is if you have a look at the SMILE string for that particular molecule, if you have a look at it, here it is at the top. What we can do is we can put some letters in front of it. You have a look at the letters in front. We have a whole range of letters in front of that, and you end up with a whole lot of different SMILE sequences. In the notebook, what we can do is we can represent all of them, and you'll notice that we have a whole range of systems that are different from each other. Okay, and then the students can then calculate this metric on the system and find that something actually has a much better quantitative estimation of drug likeness than the others. So the question is this molecule here that has a better quantitative estimation of drug likeness, is this a better one to treat COVID? Well, I've taken away a lot of the complexity, so I don't know. I don't know if it will still bind or will disrupt the machinery of COVID. But what I do know is that the students now know how to generate chemical information, and they also know how to evaluate that information. I'm not going to speak about how I've used this teaching at the MSc level, which has been quite interesting. It's been wonderful to work at the level. But this is a lovely introduction for the senior undergraduates. Okay, I'm going to change topic entirely at this point and move on to something totally different. I was a high school teacher once, but 30 years ago, I had to do a teaching prac, and there was no space at any high school for me to do that teaching prac. And so I ended up at a primary school. So 30 years ago, for 2 weeks, I was a primary school teacher. And one thing that I really remember from being a primary school teacher, I don't know why this is stuck in my mind, is that the problem of the day was comics. And it was a real problem because comics come largely from America, and teachers were seeing the American spelling coming through in the work. However, I like comics from the perspective that comics can make dynamic a situation using a static medium. And maybe I'd like to turn to the different type of software. I'm going to turn to PowerPoint and just explain another aspect to how we had to cope with lockdown and working remotely. Okay, so first of all, several of my courses were chalkboard based, as many of our work was. And so we had to somehow move from a chalkboard based system to an electronic based system. And so we had to transfer all of that information into PowerPoint. And so transferring into PowerPoint was straightforward. You have these slides now, and these slides are immensely useful to you. And I'll explain why they're useful, because there were students who didn't have access to the internet at one stage, and there were students who did. And these slides are fantastic because you can print them out, you send it to the people who don't have the internet, you then make them available online for the people who do. What else do you have? Well, the notes. The notes also had to be translated because at the beginning, my notes were scanned, and so they were like 30 megabytes. So we had to revise our notes, and we had to get the notes together. Tutorials as well were available. We were able to send those out. But an idea that I latched onto that I really liked, and so I latched onto it, was the idea of annotating slides. So I went through a lot of slides, and so I created a separate version that looks like this. And what is nice, what I liked about it is that each of the speech bubbles points to a specific area of the slide. And each speech bubble says concisely what I would have wanted to say in that lecture. That's not the only place where I like the idea of annotating slides. Also in tutorial solutions. In tutorial solutions, often there's very important information that you have to draw the attention of the student to. And it was possible then on tutorial solutions to put down the information at the appropriate place to draw their attention to that. None of this was perfectly ideal, granted. And of course, I backed all of this up. All of this could be used online, was printed and sent, but of course, backed it up with online assessment. I'll speak a lot more about online assessment. And of course, as screencasts all the way through. Okay, so that's just a brief what had been done. And you can see that some of the complexities of annotating slides. If you're annotating slides, you sometimes have to have two versions of the same slide. One where the student can see everything, and another where you have your annotations. And so I've got several of them like that. But just a side effect of that is that I have these resources that are now available. I've on occasion had to hand over my courses. So when I've been on sabbatical, or there's some courses I've handed over permanently, the feedback I've got from the staff receiving this has been very positive. So I feel like I've left the course in good hand. I've done my work on that and passed on a good set of work to those following me. Okay, chapter 4. I don't know if you've ever been reading a book. Chapter 4 is a place when you realize you've been ignoring all of those messages that have been coming through on your cell phone. You also remember that you haven't had coffee. So that is that point in the slide. So please, can I ask you to take out your cell phones now? If you have your cell phones with you, please take them out. And please, don't read messages. Can I ask you rather to go to Chrome if you've got it available? If you understand what this is here, you're welcome to use it. I'm not sure what it is. But if you go to Chrome, there's a website that I would really, really, really like you to go to. And if you don't have your cell phone, please look over someone's shoulder. You notice that I'm not doing it because I don't have my glasses with me. Okay, so some of you might have got to it by now. Do you see something like this? Okay, please, these are not pictures. These are molecules. So please try and rotate them. See that you can rotate them. And now I've got a question for you. And my question is the molecule on the left the same as the molecule on the right? Or are these two molecules different? Think about it for a moment and don't quite answer me. Is there anyone here who thinks that these molecules are the same? No one. Anyone here who thinks they're different? Okay. If you think they are the same, actually, you would be a good chemist. Because they are both xanthines. They're both powders. That's what they both look like. And, of course, if you stick them in instruments, the spectra you get
Mic check.
Okay, so this is where we were. We see the molecule on the left. This is what you find in coffee. The one on the right is what you find in chocolate. Okay. Chapter 5. In this chapter, there's a verse about kindness. Kindness to oneself, kindness to other people. And sometimes, and one of these can be quite a lot more difficult, surprisingly, than the other. Let me explain what I mean. If you teach large classes, or if you manage large classes, this is what your week looks like. You go through the weekend. Monday, you have, sorry, that's chocolate. You don't have chocolate. You have coffee. You have coffee, and then you can face the week and you start walking through the week. But I don't know if you notice what is following you. And what's following you around are those emails that are following. If you're dealing with large classes, this is what's happening. So how do you deal with them? Okay, so there's several strategies I've tried, and I'll show you what doesn't work. Okay. The first thing that doesn't work is I've tried to set boundaries. You set up a wall on the weekend. Okay. And then you happily walk through the weekend, come to Monday, and then you have, that doesn't have the methyl group, it's chocolate. You don't have that. You have the coffee with the methyl group. And then you breathe a sigh, and then you try to go on your way, and you're totally flooded by the emails. Okay, that's one strategy that I've found doesn't work either. The other way that you can do is on the weekend, you can try and fight the emails. And you really fight them, but emails, of course, fight back. So on Monday, it makes no difference if you have chocolate or coffee, because neither help. You end up a mess going through the week, and of course, the emails come back anyway. They're right there. So unconsciously, I realize I've been following a totally different strategy to try and cope. And my strategy has been quite different. My strategy is to try and find what are the problems that are causing the bulk of the emails. What are these problems? Because if we can solve what these problems are, then maybe we can survive the week. And my solutions are not perfect. And maybe you've got ideas and you'll be able to pass them on to me. But I've identified two types of problems that come through. One type of a problem is an acute problem, and the other is a more chronic problem. Here's an example of an acute problem. We have a submission deadline, and we made a mistake. We did not put the right amount of time for the submission. And so this is what it looks like. My poor colleagues probably had it far worse than I did. And so what we were doing straight after that was we were picking up pieces. And so this is what it looked like. Straight 2 minutes after the deadline, I was getting an email. And a few minutes later, it was like that. But in that evening, I counted 150 emails that we had. And if you count what my colleagues had to deal with and me, we had a real acute problem. But this is an acute problem. It's easily solvable. We've never had this problem again. We've adjusted the time for submission, and we don't get those coming through. But what is a real problem are the chronic problems. And if you're teaching a large class, I can give you an idea of where the chronic problem might come from. Here's a large class, right? But the large class might need to be split into tutorial groups, into prac days. If we are working now with as we were at the start of the year with partial lockdown and social distancing, we have to then further subdivide them into separate groups. And if you subdivide them into separate groups, now you find that some of them end up being on public holidays and some don't. So you have to deal with them differently. If I had to pick any one student in the class, it would take me a few minutes to figure out where they should be at any time. If it takes me a few minutes to figure out where they should be at any time, it means that they are going to get confused as well. And then you can imagine 150 emails times that number of minutes, do the maths. Now you're looking at hours of work trying to calm them down. So I don't have very many strategies to deal with this. I just have one, and you might have more, but let's see. Okay, one strategy is this. We do have labels on Are You Connected? We already have them. We divide them into groups. But there's a very simple thing you can know Are You Connected is you can put a label on Are You Connected, and you can make that label visible to some groups and others. I've had 3 levels of logic in this. I've had labels that are visible to group A and group B, but not group C, for example. And using these labels and this logic, every single student knows only information that's relevant to them. And I found that this has reduced my load quite significantly in terms of that. So you can see a label from this year. Your timetable for week 7 and 8 follows. And of course, we had different times that were arriving for pracs. Everyone got their own label and they were able to do that. But of course, this is not a perfect solution. And if you have other ideas for maintaining, for solving these problems, I'd be interested to know. Because if together we can solve it, if we can solve it, then what we will find is we will be able to walk our way through the weekend. We'll be able to have coffee and chocolate because we deserve it. And then we can face whatever comes our way. Okay. Right, chapter 6. Most books that you come across, if you're dealing with textbooks, have a chapter or part of a chapter on self-evaluation. And sadly, we have reached that point. So you're going to need to test yourself. And it's a really, really tough question that you're going to have to deal with. So molecule X is from a group of xanthine alkaloids. And so my question is X found mainly in coffee or chocolate? Who says coffee? Chocolate. Okay, perfect. Okay. Some books have a chapter that really want to make you throw that book as far as you can away. The author has built up this amazing character and decided in this chapter to kill them off, something like that. I have a chapter like this. This really is a difficult chapter to deal with. You see, people think of ways to make money, and one way to make money is to take a factory, get some raw material in, produce something that is either useful to society or that people want and will buy. And then, of course, you can make money back that way. But on a much darker and more serious note, we have seen it all around. We have seen it. People have this idea that you can have a business or a website where you take knowledge, where you take a group of people with amazing expertise and you use them to help students cheat and you get money back. This is a landscape in which we operate, and it's really is a problem. And so what we need is we need strategies to be robust against this. We need to protect ourselves from this, and we need to work as hard as we can against this. And there are several strategies in place. We've got Turnitin. We're all familiar with Turnitin. There's proctoring software, although there's sometimes problems with that. We've seen articles with problems with that. But one strategy that we as a team have taken in the department is in terms with, we've taken strategies for a long answer online assessments, but we've had strategies in terms of multiple choice questions. So when we've done online assessments where we've had multiple choice, my poor team, instead of asking them to set one question, they've had to set multiple questions. And then what has happened? So my team, some of you here, have had to do 5 times the amount of work in setting exam paper. They set 5 times the number of questions, and the students then get a random selection of that question. That has been a lot of work, and it's been but it has had a positive side to it, is that we've started to build up banks of questions. And these banks of questions have been added to. I know my colleague Joyce Suri has taken huge swaths of questions, formatted them in Aiken format. Aiken format, if you don't know, is a lovely format that allows you to put lots and lots of questions onto RE Connected. And as such, what we've done, one of the strategies we have to protect ourselves and to make sure that our assessments are robust is these banks of questions. So if you look very carefully, these are just 2 courses that I'd look at before the lecture. The one question has a question bank of over 700 questions, and another has a question bank of 600 questions in it. And this is from the team. But what does that mean? I had a look at the very last online assessment that we ran. And the very last online assessment had so many choices for question 1, so many choices for question 2, so many choices for question 3. And I worked out that there were 2 times 10 to the 25 possibilities. That meant that if a student came and repeated that multiple choice test every second of their lives, they would never see that same multiple choice again. It's a huge thing. But this has had consequences for us, because now we have these banks, and we not simply going to use them for assessment, we can use them in other scenarios as well. Okay, chapter 8. If you want to know how a book ends, don't go to the last chapter, that's where everyone goes home. Go to the second last chapter where everything comes together. So I just want to tie some of these ideas together. So for example, in the question banks, I sometimes use a couple of them to just get some feedback in terms of a lecture. So I'll add it to a very short quiz that these students will come. But also in terms of question banks, I like the multiple choice, but I like to focus on the closey questions. Closey questions are really fantastic on RE Connected. For example, we've had pracs in the past, pre-pracs in the past. These are fantastic. If students do these, they have to do calculations before the practical, and then they know what to do in the prac. They go to the prac knowing exactly what to do. What we've done, what we've been forced to do in lockdown, is we've been able to get these into closey format on RE Connected. This means that these are automatically marked. It's better than being marked in person, which takes resources away during a practical. It's automatically marked. The students can come back to it if they get it wrong. They can try again. So there's formative learning in these. What we've done as well, because we have the groups, we can make sure that each of them get a different version of their practical, so they have a version tailored to themselves. And we've done this for many, many of our pracs. Note that each one of these has multiple versions for multiple groups. So everyone's getting their own version of a prac that's coming through. I've loved the closey format for assessment, and I've used them in tutorials because in some of my teaching, there are 2 types of questions. There are questions that are mechanical, they're calculations that have to be done. There are other questions that are more involved, that require feedback. And so what's nice is to do the mechanical questions, put them in closey format, and the students can get them automatically marked online, and leave the resources. The tutors can mark the important questions, the questions where they really need human feedback. I've tried playing around with other questions, so this is a very quick one where you can drag the answers into place. And of course, once you've dragged in place, you get the answer right. So I've tried to play with I've tried to combine closely, and of course the modeling that you've seen on your phones. I've tried to combine all of those. And of course, maybe a final mention is a separate type of assessment is practicals. We ran online practicals in the past, and the online practicals would involve us showing how to get the data on an instrument. And then there would be a Zoom session and a WhatsApp group. If I can go back, there would be a Zoom session and a WhatsApp group for them to do calculations. And that was how we ran online practicals. But this has had a knock-on effect to the way I run practicals now. I realized that the last time I ran in-person practicals, I was spread thin all the way through the practical, introduce the students to the practical. Now that we have had these online resources, we've generated these online resources. The week before the prac, I direct them to these online resources, and they're very good. These students do have a look at them, because when I come into the practical, there are very few questions about where to start, what to do, how to get the prac on the go, what they need to do. On now my briefing. When we come into the practical, we hit the ground running, and the questions are pertinent to the practical itself. They're deeper questions. And so that is one positive effect that remote practicals has had in the long term. Okay. There's a lot I'd like to say. For instance, that I've used national software in teaching one course. I'm able to combine two versions of software. So with the MSCs, we have Python and we combine them with honors who use NIME. And so both of them are using different forms of software. They're operating at different levels, but they're still doing the same task, be able to. But I don't really have a lot of time to talk about that. So I really must come to my conclusion. And the conclusion is the most difficult thing to write in a thesis, because you have to say what you've said without saying it exactly as you've said it. So I'm going to try something different. I'm just going to scroll back. Just bear with me while I go back to the beginning. Too far, sorry, too far. I just want to go forward just a little bit and stop there. That's where I want to stop. Because some of you might have noticed that I had something written on the slide when I added the isopropyl. And these are guidelines that we have for our students when they do computational chemistry. If you're going to do computational chemistry, you need to know what the problem is before you try and solve it. Okay, and so the guiding principle is you define the problem, then you try and do a calculation and you analyze the result. And it struck me that there's an analogy with teaching, is that you need to see the problems that you're faced with and then construct a possible solution to those. But always, always, always evaluate how it's doing and work in a cycle. Okay. And lastly, there are a lot of people to thank, and I probably cannot list everyone that I need to thank. I need to thank my friends, my colleagues, my mentors, the people who have supported me, the students. And so if I've left your name out there, I'm in error. I think I need to actually thank everyone for where I'm here today. Thank you very much.
One thing I'm grateful for, became a dean when I did, that I dodged a bullet. Right here, really. So if you've been my lecturer in chemistry, why not make it in chemistry? Kevin, that was absolutely awesome. That is great. Oh,